Sharpness is the main mechanic in Monster Hunter that separates it from the many other action RPGs like Dark Souls. And it is because a lot of people from Dark Souls are coming to this game now in Wilds that I wanted to explain to you Sharpness, as it is a very misunderstood mechanic. First of all, what is Sharpness? Your weapon has a level of sharpness that you can see on this little sword icon right there. The higher the sharpness, the different the color. And green means good, right? Well, not quite. You see, if you do not have enough sharpness when you attack a monster, your attack is going to bounce. The problem with bouncing is that when you bounce, your combo gets interrupted. If you're doing a movement ability, most of them are gonna get cancelled, and that means your dash is gonna get cancelled. So in turn, it is gonna ruin your damage and you're more likely to get caught up in an attack. But does bouncing reduce damage? Now that is the number one misconception that people have, and no, it is the opposite. Damage reduction causes bouncing. The damage gets calculated, and if you do less damage than a certain value, it will bounce. Three numbers get multiplied together to calculate if an attack is going to bounce or not. I will break down each of them really quickly here, but you need to know that if these three numbers do not add up to 25 or more, your attack is going to bounce. That is the hit zone weakness multiplied by your sharpness modifier multiplied by your specific attack modifier. These three numbers are what adds up to the effective hit zone value, and that is the number that needs to be more than 25. In some Monster Hunter games, there is a random bonus of like 1 or 2, where sometimes an attack that would bounce is not going to bounce, but as far as I can tell, they got rid of that mechanic, and that's a good thing. But for the first number, what is the hit zone value? Every monster has different body parts and each part has a different toughness. That's what we call hit zone. And remember that weapons have a blunt damage and cutting damage. And yes, blunt weapons also need sharpening. Why do they need sharpening? I don't know. I didn't make the game, but they do. But people have this belief that blunt weapons bounce less, they do not need as much sharpening. And there is a reason that people get this misconception, and it is that most body parts have a higher value for blunt damage than for cutting damage. And yes, the higher the value, the more damage you do. It is backwards. It is not armor. It is, I don't know, anti-armor. It used to be simple enough back in the older games, but since World and Rise, the damage calculation formula is a bit of a mess. I am gonna leave you a spreadsheet that has the best math I could find. It is still probably not perfectly accurate because there is so many variables at play, but it's a good start. Funnily enough, bouncing doesn't affect your elemental damage or your status effects. If you get a weapon with poison or fire or whatever, it is not affected, but there is a sharpness modifier for elemental damage, and that will only affect the actual damage that you do. Also, every monster has a different hit zone value for elemental damage for each element. For example, you can have a monster like Barrot, which is weak to fire damage when it is dry, and even though he has very high armor and you are gonna bounce your attacks if you hit him on the head, your fire may very well be doing extra damage, even when you bounce. However, there is separate modifiers for elemental damage, like I said, and they are a lot more punishing. We do not know yet the exact modifiers for elemental damage, but it is very likely that just like in Worlds and like in Rise, it is gonna be minus 50% for orange and minus 75% for red. And that is a lot more loss than physical damage. But here are the actual modifiers for physical damage in Wilds. Those are known, and you get red at the start. That is your lowest sharpness. When you lose all your sharpness, you do 50% less damage. Almost every attack is gonna bounce. There is very few situations where it will not bounce. Also, if you are in red sharpness, a lot of your weapon attacks are not going to work at all. For example, if you have a gun lance and you're red, you cannot shoot. If you are in a charged blade, you cannot go into power axe mode, and so on and so forth. Orange sharpness will make your weapon work normally, but you do 25% less damage, and that's very, very bad. Then you have yellow sharpness, which is the normal 1x modifier. After that, you have green sharpness, which is the max sharpness that you start with at the game, and that is 5% extra damage. So as you can see, it is not a huge difference between green and yellow modifier. It feels like a lot mentally, but it is not. And after that, you have blue sharpness. Blue sharpness gives you 20% more damage, and that's the reason that in all the Monster Hunter games, it feels like a huge power spike when you get a blue sharpness weapon, because you go from a 5% extra extra damage to 15% more. That is huge. And finally, we have white sharpness, which is 32% more damage. It is only a 12% difference, so it is not as steep as green from blue, but it is still quite a big chunk of power. Keep in mind, there is also a purple sharpness level in a lot of other Monster Hunter games, but we have not seen it in wilds in any other footage. Most likely, because this happened in Worlds, we are gonna see the purple sharpness level with the addition of an expansion. The purple sharpness in World came out with Iceborne. That is probably what's gonna happen in Wilds. And the last number in the damage calculation, which is the attack modifier of the specific weapon. Some weapon attacks have an extra modifier. That's why it feels that some weapons cannot bounce as much. For example, the greatsword charge attack has 30% extra modifier. So even if you are in orange sharpness, a lot of your attacks are gonna land anyway, just because you get 30% more. The insect glaive, for example, has 10% bonus when you do a downward finisher, and almost every weapon has some modifier attacks. And it is very important that whatever weapon you play, you figure out the moveset and you memorize what are those attacks, because you are gonna need them at some point when you are fighting a very high armor boss. When it comes to the actual sharpening, it is a lot easier in Wilds than it used to be. First of all, the main change is that your whetstone, your sharpening stone, is infinite. It doesn't run out like it did in the old games, and that is huge. But here is how the sharpness works in a nutshell. First of all, you start with the maximum sharpness of your weapon. When you start your quest or when you go to town, the sharpness of the weapon resets. We do not know exactly how the hub system is going to work on the full release. This is talking from the beta. We don't even know what the main city is going to look like, but it is likely that it's going to be the case that way too. But you start on maximum sharpness and every attack is going to take some of your sharpness away. By how much sharpness? Well, any normal attack is going to reduce it by 1. A bounced attack is going to cost you double the sharpness, so that is very bad. You want to avoid hitting a high armor part of a monster at any cost, because not only it's gonna bounce, but also you're gonna lose sharpness in making it a lot worse. Also, blocking, for example with a greatsword, is gonna cost you 2 sharpness, and weapon-specific abilities like the gun lens is gonna cost you 1 to 3 every time you shoot, depending on the ammo, and a fully charged attack is gonna cost you 1 extra on top of that. Also, most finishers and most special attacks take a little extra sharpness. And keep in mind, every single hit takes sharpness away. It is not an individual attack. For example, you're doing, I don't know, like a finisher with the insect glaive, it is 4 hits when you go down. Every time it connects, that is sharpness getting deducted off your weapon. And that means that all things equal, the slower the weapon, the more your sharpness is gonna last. Now, how many sharpness points are in a weapon? I talk about points a lot. Well, every individual weapon has a different value, and the vanilla game doesn't actually tell you the exact number. That is like an internal hidden number. I am sure by the time we get the wiki, a proper wiki, when the game comes out, we're gonna see every exact number, but you can look at your equipment tab in the game, and you're gonna see this little bar with colors. And as you can see, every sharpness level has a different durability. Usually, the best sharpness lasts you a lot less than the bad sharpness. Eventually, the more you use your weapon, the more you're gonna drop down in sharpness until you go down to the previous level. Most of the time, if you're fighting a monster that is not very high armored and you are in green, you're fine. Most of your attacks are not gonna bounce. But of course, you want to restore your sharpness to get the better modifier, but usually it is wiser to keep hitting the monster until it flees, and then you sharpen so you don't lose as much uptime, unless you start bouncing. If you start bouncing, you gotta stop and resharpen immediately. The way you regain sharpness is with your sharpening stone in your item bar. You can select it with the D-pad and then hit square, or you can just hold your right bumper and select it with your right stick. It takes 3 strokes of the sharpening stone to get your entire weapon to max sharpness, but every stroke gives you a little bit of sharpness at a time instead of it all going at the end of the sharpening, so interrupting your sharpening is not a big problem anymore. That is a new change from Wilds that was not present in the previous games. You need to sheath your weapon to sharpen unless you have a sword and shield. It is the only weapon that doesn't need to do that. And unlike a potion, you cannot move and sharpen at the same time. There is a trick, a very broken trick, that is gonna render sharpening a lot pointless, and that is that you can ride your sacred and you can sharpen on top of your sacred. So every time the monster runs away, you just mount up and you chase him on your sacred while you sharpen. In my opinion, that is really broken. In my opinion, that shouldn't be the case. You shouldn't be able to sharpen on your sacred, but I don't want to start a Twitter war again, so we're gonna leave it at that. Also, in modern Monster Hunter, sharpening once is gonna give you all the way to max sharpness. It doesn't matter the quality of the sharpening stone, you only have one, and that is it. However, there are some specialty items that you can get that are gonna help you sharpen in some way. The only item we got to see in the beta of this kind is the wet fish, which the name implies, yes, it is a fish that you get by fishing. It is a normal sharpening stone, but it is consumable, it runs out, and it is a little faster. You can do it in about half the time of a normal sharpening stone. You can just use a fish to do it faster. There are, however, in the other games, some items that I think we're definitely gonna see in the full release in some way. There are elemental sharpening stones that give you a little bit of extra elemental damage. There are, for example, sharpening stones that give you a protective polish that is a certain amount of time that your sharpness is not gonna decline, very broken. In some of the games there is also a special sharpening stone that gives you extra sharpness on top of your maximum sharpness, and there is also some sharpening stones that give you extra sharpening value even though you don't go over the maximum, but it makes you last longer. Of course, we do not know the items we are gonna get on the full release of the game, but it is very likely one or more of these stones are gonna be present in the full game. Now, a particular thing about wilds is that you have two weapons now, and yes, each of the weapons has a different sharpness bar, so that means, just like they say in Call of Duty, switching to your sidearm is faster than reloading. The meta, the speed killing meta, is to use up a weapon, take all the sharpness out, and when you run out of sharpness, you just change to the other weapon and use that one, and that is a lot faster than stopping and sharpening. I think that's one of the reasons that they put the sacred sharpening in, to compensate, because otherwise nobody would ever sharpen if they can kill a monster fast enough. Which, again, in my opinion, beats the purpose of sharpening in the game. I think they should change that to some shared sharpness level or something, I don't know. Although that is the reason that a lot of people take a ranged weapon as a secondary weapon, like a bow, a bowgun, or a light bowgun, because they are not affected by sharpness at all. The gun lance is though, that one is. Another important thing to remember is you have decorations and you have armor skills, your set bonuses and stuff, and a lot of those bonuses can affect your sharpness in some way. Of course, we do not know them yet, but there is very likely gonna be some of the effects I mentioned, like extra sharpness or protective polish. That's one of the older games. There is also one of the abilities that was called handicraft, and it gave you extra sharpness as well, that went over your maximum even. We're gonna have to wait and see what they do for that. I am gonna be the first person to tell you about all the sets when they come out. That's gonna be an entire video. Remember that some weapons are a lot more reliant on sharpness than others. For example, dual blades is unplayable if you're in yellow sharpness, but for example the greatsword doesn't care as much because of, as I said, the modifiers. Also the hammer is very good for that. So if you don't want to deal with the mechanic at all, you can take those. But that should be sharpness in a nutshell. It is a very misunderstood mechanic, and as you can see by the freaking formulas, it is probably for a simple reason. It's kinda complicated. We are doing a tournament this February 19, the beta, with many of the best speedrunners in the game, so stay tuned. In this very channel we're gonna stream it, subscribe for that. We are also gonna make a mock tournament, a test tournament the day before, so if you wanna join for that, everybody's welcome. You can do it once again, subscribe and join the Discord. Subscribe, join the Discord, and thank you for watching.